Jainendra, and welcome everyone to Arihanta Institute's Voices in Compassion Studies speaker series. We are delighted to return to our monthly talks following last month's Compassion in Action conference. Thank you for attending this month's presentation, Compassion versus Security, What Faith-Based Approaches Can Contribute to the Discussion, with Professor Melanie Barbato. I'm Deanna Hewlett, the academic project coordinator and a graduate student here at Arihanta Institute. I'll be your co-host for the series, along with Christopher Jain Miller, who's our Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Arihanta. So before I pass it along to Dr. Miller and Dr. Barbato, I'd like to first share a few logistical details. So Dr. Barbato's presentation will go for approximately 35 to 40 minutes. And afterwards, we'll have time for questions as they come up. So the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen will be open throughout the presentation. So please ask your questions as they arise, and we'll discuss them during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. So we at Arihanta Institute would also like to thank the Ubroy Foundation for their generous support in our Compassion Studies initiative. And we hope you enjoy Professor Barbato's presentation today. And I will happily pass it on to Chris.
Jainendra, thank you so much, Deanna. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our presenter today in the Voices in Compassion Studies speaker series, Melanie Barbato from actually now the Pasifika Communities University. I understand the name of your institution has changed. Melanie Barbato is the author of Jain Approaches to Plurality, Identity as Dialogue, and the editor of Interreligious Dialogue and Diplomacy, a special issue of CrossCurrents. She's a senior lecturer in history of Christianity at the Pasifika Communities University in Suva, Fiji, and coordinates the network of Hinduism and Dialogue at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies in the UK. We are great colleagues. I really enjoy working with Melanie so much, and she's coming to us at 4 a.m. there in Fiji, which we genuinely appreciate, to do this live event. And she's also going to be offering a course for us in the Voices in Compassion Studies series. So with that being said, I would now like to turn over the floor to Professor Barbato. The title of her talk is Compassion versus Security, What Faith-Based Approaches Can Contribute to the Discussion. Welcome, Professor Barbato.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be with you here today. I will share my slides. Is that coming through?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Thank you. So first, I would like to say that I think it is really great that Arihanta Institute has started this Compassion Studies initiative. I think when we talk about Jainism, there is often a lot of discussion about animal ethics, on vegetarianism, and so on, which is really great and important. But I really appreciate the focus of this project on compassion as something that is happening from human to human. Of course, not exclusively, but that really gives space for this. I'm particularly interested in how religious or philosophical concepts are applied to contemporary challenges. And of course, security is one of the most fundamental challenges. It goes right down to the matter of biological survival. And of course, then we talk about security in many different forms, more towards human flourishing. But when it comes to what are the challenges that really are fundamentally human, then security is a topic that really affects everyone. So I came to this topic of security by participating in an academic project on food security that was by the Center for Religion, Human Values and International Relations at Dublin City University. And it brought together academics, but also people from more practical backgrounds, really thinking about how religious actors can be part of that discussion on food security And it was just one part, religion was just one part of that bigger report. And I really liked how the religious voices were integrated into a bigger report that was speaking not a religious community to religious community, but a religious community maybe to EU policymakers and so on. So I really like that. And since then, I have been fascinated by security as a concept that has so many layers. So from political security of the nation state to the psychological security of feeling at ease in one's own skin, to then in a more religious context, the security of the liberated soul that is not disturbed by anything anymore. And I have recently recorded my material for the Arihanta course on human security as compassion. The starting point for that course was that one of the fundamental ways that we can show compassion towards other people is by helping them to live without fear. Because if we take security, it has that side of actually being free from threats, but it also has this inner side of feeling safe. So I think when we think about how we can be compassionate towards others, it's can really be connecting to security in both of these aspects, preventing threats from affecting people, but also making people feel safe. So preventing the fear of bodily harm, the fear of hunger, the fear of poverty. And that course that I'm offering, it pursues a values-based approach to security. It is about how we can think security and compassion together as concepts that interlink. And what I'm trying to show in that course is that this really makes sense from a Jain perspective, especially in the context of nonviolence. But I think that we have to acknowledge that there is also the opposite notion, compassion versus security. And by that, I mean the idea that compassion is sometimes thought to be opposed to security, that compassion is detrimental to security. And looking at this claim is the topic of today's presentation. What I will do is first to talk about that opposition between security and compassion that is often constructed in the media or in public discourse. I will show how the 2022 United Nations Development Program Special Report on Human Security is trying to do something different or maybe counteracting. And that report has added solidarity to other concepts. These two other concepts are protection and empowerment, as making up together 3 strategies for human security in the Anthropocene. And rather than just saying it is compassion and security or compassion against security, I'd like to try to show the complexity of these issues and how people have wrestled with these. In particular, I will give some examples from religious traditions, what faith-based approaches can contribute to the discussion, as some starting points to maybe our discussion afterwards. Okay, so compassion versus security. The clearest way in which compassion might be seen these days to clash with security is on the issue of immigration. So calls for a compassionate approach towards refugees or all forms of migrants are often met with arguments about the security of the host country population. So according to this view, immigrants, they might be refugees or economic migrants, are seen predominantly as a security risk. The idea is that compassion could motivate the population to accept large numbers of immigrants and award them certain benefits or be lenient on security checks. So all kinds of things that might come from that kind of emotional motivation of compassion, but turn out not good for their own security situation. So in other words, that compassion could be seen as clouding judgment on security issues. And that, on the other hand, the most rational action in terms of security would, according to this view, possibly produce pictures that clash with our sense of compassion, like people being turned away at borders or deportations, or families being unable to unite, and that the rational approach requires some kind of suppression of our compassionate response. I'm originally from Germany, so in Europe, this conflict has been discussed, particularly when it comes to migration across the Mediterranean Sea. Many migrants cross the Mediterranean in small and often overloaded boats, and many lives are lost to drowning. So in the year since 2014, over 30,000 migrants have been recorded either dead or missing in the Mediterranean. And there are NGOs that seek to rescue the shipwrecked. And by one side, they are seen as doing the only decent and compassionate thing. And by the other side, they are sometimes seen as accomplices of people smugglers and as increasing a security risk for the affected countries, and sometimes even for the migrants themselves. So in that view, it is said that people smugglers, they put the migrants into an unfit vessel, and it is already calculated into the equation that they will get into distress shortly after and be then carried to safety by these NGO rescue boats. According to Anna Einham-Naper, a study showed that the media coverage of the 2015 refugee crisis in 8 European countries was largely informed by the framework of humanitarian security in articles that featured the need for care and compassion towards refugees. And on the other hand, coverage that supported increased militarization, such as sending refugees and migrants back, closing borders, and increasing the presence of police guards, they portrayed such actions as ways to protect the country. So according to Naper, Scandinavian media in general portrayed asylum seekers either as threats or as victims. So as threats, they are a security issue, and as victims, they are deserving of compassionate action. So we have that dichotomy there in public discourse. Naper points out that Danish media coverage of immigration has focused on the dominant themes of crime, social problems, and Danish values, while other studies attest in certain contexts a solidarity framework on migrant issues. And an article on Journal MT, that's an online publication established by the Maltese Labour Party, criticizes the EU migration policy for its security framing and argues that for a more humane and effective migration policy, it is essential to adopt a nuanced approach that balances security with compassion and addresses both the symptoms and root causes of migration. So we have on the one side that that dichotomy, that differentiation between compassion and security, and on the other hand, we have calls, even in this strongly polarized settings, for finding some kind of balance and thinking about a better way how we can bring compassion and security together. It could be argued that such a desire for balance can be found in the 2022 United Nations Development Programme Special Report on Human Security that has added solidarity to protection and empowerment as the main strategies for human security in the Anthropocene. By Anthropocene is meant the kind of time of our planet in which human beings really started to have a fundamental impact on shaping the living conditions for all other life forms on the planet. So it's not a specific or clearly set date for that. People vary widely when they set it, but the acknowledgement of using that term is that now we are definitely in that stage where the planetary living conditions, they are affected so much by the human impact. So that is a term used in that UN report to highlight the particular nature of the challenges that we are facing today. So new threats to human security in the Anthropocene demanding greater solidarity. That is the title of that report. And this report draws on the still fresh experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. It highlights the achievements of scientists who developed highly effective vaccines in record time. But it also warns in a kind of gloomy or almost prophetic tone that the pandemic could represent a dry run of worse things to come. What it calls a series of ever-growing waves crashing into the inability of governments and the international community to empower and protect people around the world, but especially the most vulnerable. And in the face of such challenges, it predicts that fragmented security responses will likely be ineffective in the long run. Instead, it calls for a renewed social contract, and more specifically, the report argues for expanding the human security frame in the face of this new generation of threats. And it suggests to add solidarity to the human security strategies of protection and empowerment that were proposed by the Ogata-Sen report in 2003. So here at this point, it might be a good time to distinguish between three concepts: empathy, compassion, and solidarity. Of course, there is no ultimate authority over the meaning of these words, and some might understand them somewhat differently from how I use them here. You might differ from me in how you would define them. So as far as I see it, empathy is the ability to resonate with another person's positive or negative feeling. We feel their pain or joy almost physically in our bodies. And empathy is not automatically oriented towards the other. So the reaction to empathy can be a decision to withdraw, to cut ties, to turn away from the suffering person, to avoid that unpleasant feeling that is aroused in us by their perception. So there's this like rather bad taste joke of a man who sees his elderly mother and says, "Mom, I cannot bear seeing you all day working in the kitchen. Can you please close the door?" Like that's an example of someone having empathy, but that results not in kind of wanting to alleviate the suffering of that person, but in asking the person to shut the door so that the same situation continues, but without the burden of having to suffer the empathy. And compassion, on the other hand, is more directed towards the other. Compassion is a tender feeling that wants to do good for the other. And therefore, I think it needs to have an action component to be genuine. Yeah, it would be interesting to see. I assume as part of this Compassion Studies initiative, you had quite a few definitions of compassion already. So they might be slightly different, but yeah, that's something that I think is really important. And is the turning towards other as both a tender emotion and an impulse for reducing that suffering. So when Elon Musk, for example, speaks about suicidal empathy as the fundamental weakness of Western civilization and the West empathy response as being exploited, what he's doing is he criticizes empathy that leads to a compassionate response towards migrants or more vulnerable members of society. And that, of course, is the epitome of compassion versus security. So these quotes by Elon Musk have been going around like saying empathy, but really meant in the sense of compassionate action. That's the weak spot of Western civilization that is setting up really that distinction. If you want to be secure, you should not be compassionate. Solidarity, in contrast to compassion, is more about collectively acting together, making a commitment to work particularly with those who are suffering and to alleviate the suffering and to support their agency. So like compassion, solidarity has an action component, but its emphasis is less on the emotional basis than on the commitment that is made, maybe on the basis of compassion. So I would say, despite the differences, these three concepts are interlinked. solidarity, like compassion, will lead to action that is not primarily self-interested, but done for the sake of the other that is experiencing suffering, disadvantages, or injustice. And so global solidarity, it could be argued, is not possible without compassion towards those who suffer. So what we see in the 2022 report is the United Nations including solidarity into a security framework as a fundamental security strategy. That is almost as if to say, and compassion can be a strategy to achieve security. So it's very different from that idea that you have to limit your compassionate response in order to maintain security as something separate, almost where your emotions, they are leading you astray from the rational forms of pursuing security. So let us now see what this adds to human security. Human security is the idea that security should not be defined merely in terms of state security, like the military or territory or international relations, which is a very top-down approach, which takes as the primary point of reference the nation state. So there have been calls to take more account of the human being, because we think, what does the state exist for? Well, in the ultimate rationale, it should be in doing good for human beings. It should not have a justification outside of human life. So there has been this human security approach being developed as thinking from the individual human being and his or her need to be free from fear and free from want, to live securely and to feel safe. And then to think, going up one level, of the different kinds of communities that people form, and also the self-protection. Not just with the nation state and the protection of territorial integrity. The human security approach then identifies different subtypes of security that have to be in place, such as food security, the availability of sufficient and nutritious food at all times, or health security, which relates to the accessibility, for example, of medical services, or environmental security that recognizes the importance of the environment for human flourishing. Now, if human security focuses on the individual and the community, here's what the 2022 report has to say that solidarity adds to the picture. Solidarity recognizes that human security in the Anthropocene must go beyond securing individuals and their community to systematically consider interdependence across all people and between people and the planet. For each of us to live free from want, from fear, and from indignity, all three strategies must be deployed. For this protection, empowerment, and solidarity working together that advances human security in the Anthropocene. So this was a quote directly from the report, pointing not just to individuals and communities, but also to interdependence. So the point of this solidarity strategy is not to introduce another layer in the way that the nation state focus of conventional security was supplemented by the concern for the security of the individual and the community, but to point towards the interconnectedness of all people as individuals and as members of communities or the nation state, as well as the interconnectedness of humans and the planet. So the report is a renewed call to not think security predominantly in terms of national security. And in conclusion, it connects to the 1994 Human Development Report that introduced the concept of human security into the language of the United Nations. And the final paragraph of that 2022 report states, when the 1994 Human Development Report was published, the idea of human security challenged the conception of security and moved the debate from territories to people. And as we face new global, systemic, and interconnected threats, recognizing our common fate as humanity implies that we have agency to shape our future. We will not be able to face the systemic, global, interconnected threats individually or by focusing only on narrow national interests. For each of us to live free from want, from fear, and from indignity will require that everyone live free from want, fear, and indignity. As the vaccine inequality problem shows, humanity's problem is not lack of ingenuity, but an inability to see our security in the security of another. So the 2022 report seeks to defend a solidaric and compassionate approach as the only strategy towards future security. And we have here directly the paralleling of interconnected threats that are more and more common in our age. They require interconnectedness and solidarity, and I would say compassion as the response. Although compassion is not explicitly mentioned in the report, the strong emphasis on solidarity and interconnectedness can be understood as going against other tendencies that increasingly see security as self-isolation, closing borders, and the contrasting of compassion versus security. However, in line with the human security approach, we put our focus on the value of the individual human life. We also have to acknowledge the tough questions that underlie the compassion versus security discussion. Stanford student Ria Karaturi discusses a question raised by David French's article. The article has the title, "It is time for honest talk about Muslim immigration." So the student does not agree with that article, but she wants to seek a response to that question, which is, some immigrants from jihad zones will be involved in murdering Americans. Is this an acceptable price for compassion? Sorry if this is kind of offensive in the way it is put. It's just about how to engage with these questions. So the author is not at all comfortable with the premise that is implied in these questions, such as that Muslim groups will automatically contain terrorists, but she wants to find like a response to take out the power of that argument that it might have on some people. And her initial response is that compassion is more important than fear, but then she's not satisfied with that answer, and she turns to another distinction, that is the political and the personal level. So she calls for us not to settle just for the distinction between compassion and non-compassion, but she asks the author of that article and others to pause. So she says, my answer to French is convoluted and perhaps doesn't answer the question at all, but how like your position is to, in your honest conversation of immigration, to even skip that question of what is the opposite of compassion, so that you can afford to not be compassionate, that you can sit there in America while your country is engaged in conflict abroad, and you can ignore that question of those who are made homeless by the violence. So the idea is that turning down people who come to one's door, real physical people, it's very hard. So then politics is suddenly about personal ethics, not just about political decisions of a sovereign state. But security is often presented as that decision of a sovereign state who has every justification for acting just self-interestedly. But when you take it back to the personal level, then it's not so clear anymore that this pure self-interest can ever be justified. So Karaturi thus answers the question in the affirmative. If compassion and security at times clash, compassion is more important than security. She states, it is our job to reduce the scope of arguments that invoke security and to pause to think. I don't mean thinking logically or thinking cleverly. I do not even mean anything about thinking about real facts. I simply mean that we should give this thought, need to bring ourselves to care enough to grapple in a real way with what it means to say that someone cannot come into this country, what it means to those who are already here, those who dream of a better life, what it means to say that they don't deserve our care because an accident of birth put them in that country and you in this one. So what she asks for is basically to take the time to meditate, I would almost say, in a mindful and emotionally vulnerable way over the real human cost of security rhetoric. And it is on a fundamentally human level, where these distinct categories of American versus non-American, for example, do not apply. So that is where easy rhetoric does not satisfy. So this raises another fundamental set of questions. Compassion for whom and security for whom? And as I was preparing for this presentation, actually another tough ideological conflict came for me to mind. That's like the polarized debates about abortion. So some people will claim that they want to see a right for safe abortion, and then immediately the other side of the camp will say there is no safe abortion because always one person dies, this is the fetus. Then the automatic response to that will be, no, the fetus is not a person. And these kind of responses, they are already set back and forth what they are. And so I was thinking in terms of rhetorical strategy, it is similarly about excluding or including certain forms of life from deserving compassion or from deserving the right to security. And so again, I'm not saying here about a specific response to either immigration or abortion, but to see that we have on both sides of the political spectrum these selective approaches to compassion and selective approaches to the prioritization of security. And the same can also be said to the United Nations. So the antagonism of compassion versus security is not as simplistic as it will often seem. So typically there is some form of in-group and out-group, and very few people will be as blunt in their claims as, for example, Elon Musk has been in the media. So now, what can faith-based approaches bring to this discussion? I will start with a Christian approach. The journalist Griffin Paul Jackson discusses the challenge of seeing security pitted against compassion. He sees this dichotomy as going against the biblical call to live without fear. At the same time, he acknowledges that the desire for security can be legitimate, and that it is legitimate to be cautious and to want to preserve a good life for oneself. So he also acknowledges that compassion can be naive, like some people might call for a completely unregulated acceptance of all migrants who want to enter a country. So faith-based discussions, they can engage with all of the complexities of the topic. The main point of his article is that security cannot be everything. He denounces what he calls an insatiable lust for safety and warns of the danger of being conquered by one's need for security. So pretty strong language here. As if in an answer to David Freud's question that I just discussed, he writes that it is simply not Christian nor very rational to admit that the risk that 1 in 50,000 Syrian refugees is a terrorist bent on murdering Americans justifies banning them all. So he calls this mental gymnastics. While much of the call for security, according to his view, is really just masking prejudice or nationalism or other forms of what in the Christian view would be kind of false attachment or false worship to idols in that sense. And in contrast to that nationalist Christian, or what he opposes Christian attitude, he cites a Christian pastor from Lebanon. In the 1970s, Lebanon was a Christian majority country with over 60% Christian populations, but now, partly due to immigration from Muslim majority countries, it has itself become a Muslim majority country. So this Lebanese pastor made the claim, made a statement during a new wave of predominantly Muslim refugees coming into the country. And he said, survival is not a Christian value. What is a Christian value is loving your neighbor and all your enemies. So I think this is a powerful statement because it is not made from like a German comfortable living room or, but from a testing situation where many would have sympathy if that person would be frustrated and maybe suffering from compassion fatigue. So certainly that pastor is not against survival, but he also is against the idolarization of security. This has happened in many countries. And it is used to brush away compassionate concern for fellow human beings. One of the roles of faith-based approaches, I think, can be to challenge the abstract language of security that sounds reasonable and without alternative by bringing the discussion back to the human being, not as a security threat, but as a neighbor. Well, when it comes to Jainism, there are many ways in which this tradition can contribute to the discussion. So, for example, Anekantavada, the teaching of the non-one-sidedness of reality, that can warn against the simple dichotomies that we often find in these very polarizing debates, such as security versus compassion. Reality is almost always more complex. So if we insert fiat in some way into our sentences, we realize how limited the perspectives expressed, for example, by Elon Musk are. So is empathy the vulnerable spot of soft spot of Western civilization? I think we don't have to go far back in history to see the exact opposite also in many ways. So we can only mention British, French, or Belgian colonialism, where there you could equally attest the opposite view about Western civilization, but that too would be limited. So we can see that many of these claims that have these strong polarizing effects, they are only providing a very limited perspective, and they're not really helpful for finding a good way forward for humanity. Anekantavada can help to open oneself to the fuller picture, which can mean removing such self-protective blinkers, and I think also making ourselves prepared for the kind of introspection that was requested in that more meditative space. Jainism also has a long history of asceticism that renounces spiritual advancements toward liberation, that renounces even personal security for that spiritual advancement toward liberation. So it's about not using violence even in self-defense and showing a disregard for their security, because the spiritual perfection is valued higher than even the survival. Now, this might not be the way of the common person, but it shows that Jainism can help us to reorder our values and warn against automatic polarization of security. And this includes resisting securitization, that is the shifting of topics into the space of making it a security issue, like what has happened to immigration. And from Professor Chris Jane Miller, I learned that security and safety are among the few translations of ahimsa in the Sanskrit dictionary. So I think in our world where security is so much about militarization, we can explore the importance of nonviolence, of ahimsa for security. And Jainism places great value on the respect for the bodily integrity of even small living beings. So valuing the security of even the ant or the beetle. So, but what then does it mean for the human being? And I think the interconnectedness of all life, including humans and the plant, that is now mentioned in the 2022 UN report, that is a fundamental assumption for the Jain understanding of the universe. Rather than people being antagonistic, we find the view that souls render service to another, which is a very different view from that fundamental suspicion that underlies much of the security discussion. And also that meditative approach, it's not tradition specific, but Ria Karuturi, she's from India originally. So I think that also resonates with Jainism, that reflection, that pausing, that quietness, and going into oneself about the harm done intentionally or unintentionally, to start with oneself and one's action, to think before going out and talking in these kind of prefixed rhetorical topics. And last year, Areti Siani, Chief of Mission at the United Nations Refugee Agency, India and the Maldives, she spoke on refugee protection and the need to balance, again, national security and humanitarian concerns. And beside that obvious human rights language, she refers to the golden rule as the shared ethical yardstick, which is there in many religious traditions, that do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So here we can see also some fundamental principles, or she also quotes Gandhi, you must be the change you want to see in the world. And that is no exception, that in many speeches by people from the UN, by people from different organizations, they come to religious language when they want to appeal for things, because that is more powerful than the human rights language. So religious traditions, they really have that long tradition of also dealing with people's insecurity, of finding powerful images, powerful language. And so faith-based actors, they're not merely multipliers for ideas of international institutions, but they can themselves bridge the past, the future, and that insecurity, which is so much marking our current age. I think in terms of time, it's good for me to stop now so we can go into discussion. Is that correct?
When you like, Melanie, you still have
Yes,
a few more
okay.
minutes if you'd like to conclude.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm fine here. I would like to go into discussion. If that is fine, we can expand on any of these things. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, bravo. Thank you so much, Melanie. Once again, you've engaged so much with us over the past few months, podcasts, conference presentations, and now this wonderful presentation on human security as compassion. So thank you, I want to say up front. Yeah, I've got a lot of questions here related to your presentation. One thing I want to just put out there that I really appreciate is that you're, as I understand, a theologian, and so you're helping to kind of help us interpret various religious traditions and texts in light of these questions around human security and compassion. In some ways, kind of taking theological points and secularizing them, or bringing them into secular conversations, I should say, not secularizing them, but bringing them into conversation with secular issues. One thing that I experience here in Switzerland, and I'm sure it's similar in Germany, is that there are indeed, as you said, quite a number of refugees coming from many places around the world right now. And I think anyone who lives here right now is experiencing that. I'm affiliated with a church nearby. This is a Christian church where there are a lot of refugees and people who come from many of the countries that you spoke of in your presentation and more, Ukraine, Syria, number of places from all over the world. Some of them, as you say, have come across on boats. They were lucky enough to survive that awful trip coming across the Mediterranean. And in that, I kind of see like a third prong here that of security. So in some ways, there's a kind of brutal side to security that you've pointed out, that it can be brutal. It can be kind of anti-immigration and really the policing of people. On the second hand, there's a sort of rehabilitative form of security where people try to help refugees, but in a very bureaucratic way, right? In a way that sees them as a number and as a kind of cog in a wheel that needs to be fixed somehow. And so it still lacks this element of what you're describing, which I see as a third kind of category here of what we might say security, which is this compassion element, where it's a very kind of compassionate approach to being with others, because you come to that next stage that you described, which I appreciated so much, of solidarity here. And so I guess I'm kind of riffing on what you have presented here, because it really resonates with my experience in Switzerland of seeing in this church that I'm affiliated with, where they are helping people to integrate, and it's a combination of a church and secular resources from the Swiss government that come together in a space that teaches language, doesn't necessarily teach theology, although theology is in the background, but it teaches language, it teaches integration, it helps people find jobs, it helps with these kinds of things. And I thought of this as just one example, and I was wondering if you had any examples you wanted to provide to us of this kind of I'm just calling it very compassionate integration or rehabilitation, this compassionate security in some kind of organizations, big or small, besides the UN. I mean, I know you mentioned the UN as a particular example, but are there other examples where you see this happening, where there's this kind of like theological impulse from people that's intersecting with secular concerns of security?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for pointing out these kind of three types of security. I have not thought of it like that systematically, but I agree very much. And I think that compassion-based approach, as you say, it's still not it's not just emotional. It's also about practical skills like language teaching, like maybe going to the council offices together to fill in forms. So it's a combination, and that's something that I think marks a religious agency, or often religious organizations. They are often portrayed as purely otherworldly, but that is, I think, for no religious tradition the case. They all also care about the well-being of people, and all have to some degree the call to not distinguish radically between people. So reaching out to hospitality, for example, that's like a value that is there in, as far as I know, all religious traditions. So that bridging of the theological realm into what can be seen as secular, it does not necessarily have to be seen as secular in a kind of dichotomy, because religion is never just religious. It is always about flourishing also. So one thing I would say is that many people in Germany, from my country, they seem to have a very short memory. Because, for example, when I think back at my own family history, both my grandfathers are Sudeten Germans. So they were migrants at one point when they had to leave their, after World War II, their home country, and they came with just a suitcase to Germany, and they relied on the kindness of people in Germany. And obviously it's easier to blend in if you look like the host population, but it should not be forgotten that at some point in history, many of us relied on kindness and compassion. And I think it's churches, but it's also, for example, many Muslim immigrants, after they have settled in, they will, in organized or not so organized form, support the new people who come there, and they will then help them to get into the integrating into society. So we have these organizations, or often very grassroots organizations, that help people to find their way in the place. And then we have to see to what degree is it really assimilating, is it integrating? And I think these are negotiation processes, and it's very interesting to see what is going on in these church or mosque communities about finding a new path together. And it's true, we often focus on the negative, but it's also amazing the kind of ability that many communities show to accommodate and to be flexible. Like, for example, the many Ukrainian people now in church communities and so on.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I just thought of it when I thought of, for example, my wonderful German teacher here, who for years she's retired, she's Christian, and she sees a kind of place to continue her mission as a volunteer doing the work that you're describing, of helping people learn the language, integrate. She's not making money doing it, but she sees this very secular task as, in fact, a very Christian task, so to speak, right? The actual process of extending compassion in this way becomes for her mission and her life work. So it just reminded me of that. Yeah.
Can I just very briefly respond, because you used the word mission, which obviously in like the Indian context is a very loaded word, to say as someone's mission. So yeah, thank you for touching that. So I'm part here of, like, it's called Mission and Interfaith Center, which for some would say, oh, well, how do these two go together? But exactly in that way, as you described, that a Christian or some other religious person's mission can be to make the world a better place for all, including better interfaith relations, helping people in need, helping migrants, and so on. So we can think about religious mission not as kind of preying on people for conversion, but on looking, there's a person who might be in need, or who might just be someone to collaborate with for joint action or in solidarity. So yes, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, I suppose your institution there is very much at that kind of intersection, right? As many are, and there's different ways to take missions and colonialism and these ideas, and they can go in good or bad directions and everything in between, right? It's not black and white, but it's always interesting, particularly to me as someone who's trained as an ethnographer, to see how these worlds kind of engage with one another. It happens in the Jain world too, you know, when they're serving their communities, as you pointed out as well. Um, I maybe as a final question here, I realize we're getting close to the end of the time, and you can say whatever else you'd like to add, but a lot of it's really interesting how a lot of people seem to, from the perspective of like political psychology, they're unable to experience for some reason empathy and then compassion, which would then possibly lead to this feeling of solidarity. Um, I see your work and the kind of work that you're discussing here as critically important for addressing this issue of you spoke of Musk, for example, and others. There's a kind of inability or an unwillingness to even see that feeling as something worth experiencing, whereas it seems fundamental to the human experience to be able to do it. But in political psychology, I've recently been looking a little bit into this, that some people are literally incapable of having this experience, and it makes me sad to think that people are unable to experience this. But what do we do with this, what seems like growing mass, you know, of people from a lot of religious traditions, not any one particular tradition, who somehow uh, have lost contact with the ability, or maybe don't have the ability to truly experience the depth of the human experience that you're describing here? Do you have any, how can we be more compassionate in our lives, I guess is what I'm asking very simply, but pointing out this, flagging this issue that seems to be rampant right now in society?
Yeah, I think in a way we have to also see how to deal with these people, in the sense that on the one hand they are deserving of our compassion because they are clearly lacking. Like from a Jain point of view, for example, this is a very bad point for your spiritual development. It's not like much good is to be expected for the foreseeable future if you approach life with that perspective. So we should think, how can we help them? How might they be able to be more compassionate? On the other hand, obviously in society also security from these people is also needed. So I would say, yes, despite all compassion, we need to regulate our social media policies and so on, what kind of hate speech can be shared. And here I think you can still be compassionate while trying to limit the influence of such polarizing or extreme opinions. And I would say for oneself, I have benefited a lot from that Jain approach, that helping or being non-violent towards others is actually what gets you ahead in your own journey towards liberation. So I think when communities point more towards that win-win situation, or like that the passage that I read before about from the UN document, our inability to see our security in the security of the other, I think it's not giving up, but continuing to strengthen that aspect in educating children, in how we talk about challenges, that it's not one or the other, but that even for our very self-interest, if we define self-interest as ultimately the security of the soul, then we have to learn to be compassionate, even if it's hard, even if it's a spiritual struggle.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like how you spiritualize the struggle in a way of extending compassion to those and maybe trying to help them experience it themselves if they're not already able to do so, which is of course a very often difficult task. We are getting close to the end of time. I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to this before I hand it over to Diana. There's so much more we could talk about, and I know your course that's coming up discusses these issues in great detail as well. But I do really want to thank you for coming. Is there any last words you have for our audience?
Yeah, just maybe one last thought, that what I'm encouraging, just or what I want to do myself, is to feel free in thinking about security interdisciplinary, saying it as an academic, but not to be stuck by one field, but to, for example, as a religious person, to dare to approach a UN document with the eyes of a religious person, and to think I have a voice in this discussion, even though might not be like awarded to me at this point, but really think, what does security mean, not as compartmentalized topics, but as things that really have to interconnect because ultimately reality makes sense as a whole. And I think that religious or faith-based perspectives, they can speak to any topic. And I really like these translation processes. And I like this discussion, but this is possible. So thank you very much for having me and for engaging with that. Thank you.
I think you've left a great opening here, an assignment for us as we leave today, an assignment for us to all reflect on precisely that question from whatever tradition or background or philosophical perspective we come from, how we can make the world a more compassionate place and look into security in particular as a topic, and maybe become more engaged in our local communities from, again, the perspective that we have. And there'll be, of course, manifold perspectives. And your approach is such a Jain approach because it's so open to these manifold perspectives. So thank you so much to Professor Melanie Barbato for a wonderful talk. And we look forward to seeing your course as well as your podcast coming out soon. That will be not long off from now. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Deanna Hewlett, to make a few announcements and bring us to a close. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And thank you everyone for joining us today or whenever you are watching our replay for our Voices in Compassion Studies talk with Melanie Barbato. Here at Arihanta Institute, we are deeply grateful for Melanie's critical field of study in human security and the importance of integrating compassion into this just very essential conversation. So we hope to see you next month on June 17th for our Voices in Compassion Studies talk, Health is the Greatest Wealth One Can Give to Self and Others, with Dr. Nitin Shah, and the link is there in the chat. All our best to you, and may we navigate the path forward with kindness and collective solidarity. Jai Janendra.